Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my 2022 Literary Journals Spotlight in my short story spotlight playlist, which I'll link down below. It's basically my chance to look at more small publishers and share them with you guys, and read more short stories that I usually wouldn't be able to get my hands on because in this video, I bought 3 random editions of 3 random literary journals, one of which just published my own short story, Cliffs and Vistas, which I talked about last week in my author's answer video, which I'll link down below. And the other 2 I have are the Sycamore Review and the Baltimore Review. So I thought I'd give you just a little bit of background on each of these 3 literary journals, and then personally highlight one of the short stories in each that really spoke to me. It's going to be a little uneven because the Baltimore Review is actually much larger than the other 2 because it is a bind-up of several editions that they have online. So there's a lot more stories to go through, and I figured I'll highlight a few more because of that. But to start with the Main Street Rag, this is a quarterly publication that has been in print since 1996. The editor is M. Scott Douglas, and from creating this quarterly magazine, he's gone on to have standalones, published standalones in his small press, around 75 to 100 per year, in fact, of poetry, prose, and anthologies. And in the actual journal, they publish poetry, short stories, art, interviews, book reviews, and other literary commentary. The gestalt of this magazine is pretty cool. It's kind of like taking a rumble through various parts of America mostly, although one of the pieces in here is international. But we start with a passenger list, which is a spiffy way to do the table of contents. And then each contributor, instead of having a bio at the end of our pieces, it says where exactly we're from. So it really is kind of like taking a cool trip around to our various homes. The Sycamore Review is a publication of Purdue University's College of Liberal Arts and the Department of English. They've been in print since 1989, and they publish 1 to 3 times a year. They feature poetry, fiction, nonfiction, interviews, and book reviews. And I specifically wanted to seek out and highlight this magazine because the university administration is threatening to shut down the MFA program, which is what the Sycamore Review is published under, so the Sycamore Review would go down with the MFA program. And of course, as a reader and a writer, I feel like that's a great shame, the way that so many people dismiss the value of humanities and of writing, so I wanted to give them a shout out here. And finally, the Baltimore Review is a little bit of local pride for me. I was born in the city. This magazine was founded in 1996 by editor Barbara Westwood Deal, and she still serves as senior editor. The quarterly publication is now digital, and at the end of each year, as I mentioned before, they do a bind-up of all 4 issues that you can buy in a print version. And they publish poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. Of course, I didn't want to highlight my own story in this video because I figured that would be a little bit biased. But the fiction story I am highlighting kind of reminds me of Cliffs and Vistas in a weird way. Cliffs and Vistas is actually a bit supernatural, or it has a supernatural conceit in that a dead friend Zoom calls the protagonist during the COVID pandemic, during the first year of the pandemic. And Halfway Home by Paul Colby isn't supernatural at all, but it features 2 friends separating after spending, some time together, and one friend gives the other friend directions home, and that friend never actually makes it home. And for the next couple of years, spanning like, a couple of days to a couple of weeks to a couple of months, the protagonist would get calls on the phone from his friend, basically, technically still saying he's on his way home and like, oh, I'm still trying to find directions, but he ends up basically cruising around at an unknown location. The protagonist wants to drop things and find him and bring him home, but this guy seems content to sort of cruise around and, migrate to different people and do different things on the road to survive. Meanwhile, his house is dormant and he's mostly just interested in getting the protagonist to feed his cat. And amidst all of this, the protagonist, goes through a divorce proceeding, and part of that does seem to be based on the fact that his wife thinks his friend is playing a big practical joke on him and doesn't really like the friend, and the protagonist is a little more concerned. And also he has to switch jobs, and it seems like part of that is because at his former job, he spent a lot of time at the end being very preoccupied trying to track down this friend rather than do his work. So I guess the way it really reminds me of my own story is that sense of loss and displacement that I talk about through the supernatural and COVID and that sort of thing. And Colby talks about by having this guy supposed to just be going home and following directions home, but he never really gets there, and he throws off the protagonist as well. I decided to go for a piece of flash fiction in the Sycamore review. I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little bit tired here. There is also a beautiful piece of artwork next to the beginning of the story, so anyway. This is a story about a missing girl who turns up alive, but it's told through the perspective of the psychic medium who predicted to the police that she was already dead. So obviously for her, in a way, this is a bit of a setback, because now she's less trustworthy because this girl turned out to be alive. So this one does go into some supernatural meanderings and into the idea that, being silent and still in a dangerous situation isn't that different from being dead, and maybe that's why this psychic medium couldn't find her as being alive. And there's ruminations too on the fact that just because she's back doesn't mean she's the same person. And of course this level of emotionality seems to hint that the protagonist has had similar experiences. We go a very vague little bit into her family life with that, and also how freaked out she was to get a little bit of a glimpse of the perpetrator, the kidnapper, which usually she doesn't get. So yeah, it was mostly an emotional, visceral story, I think, about the pain of having something like this happen, and really what it means to come out of it. Carolyn Albert's Telephone was a contest winner for Flash Fiction, so it's a story that's kind of meant to leave a fleeting impression. That's kind of how I see Flash Fiction. Anyway, this is the story that starts with a young girl, Nan, who has a stutter, and she witnesses her mother at some sort of social event privately making out with a college girl. And she tries to tell this to her friends at school, but nobody can make the words out. And that turns into sort of a pastiche of how girls come to her with their secrets because they know that she would kind of garble them and ergo have to keep them secret, so that it's like they can confess, but she can't quite tell what they are. And meanwhile, her parents are divorcing and everything kind of gets worse there. So it's about how these secrets and lack of communication can have negative emotional impacts, I think. And it ends with her as an adult where she had mastered her stutter, but there's still that sense of unease in her life because of those formative experiences. And in fact, she compounds the problem, because even though she doesn't have a stutter, she marries a deaf man and whispers into his ear at night like how she won't love him, and these same sorts of emotionally fraught secrets. Eliot Gish's The Wedding Night is a sort of ghost story within a ghost story, I think, or at least the emotionality of a ghost story, where on the wedding night between two people, a bride tells a groom a ghost story about another young bride to a much older man having a post-traumatic freak-out experience as she's waiting for him to come and consummate the marriage. And there's also language about how she's really quite innocent to what that means too. So she's quite at a power disadvantage, and she comes into the room alone with a candle in the dark and sees this wardrobe that starts whispering in female voices about all the ways that they died. And she's already freaked out about the wardrobe because this is a very victimized young woman who had a formative experience in a wardrobe when her older brother locked her in one for hours and nobody could hear her to, get her out of there. So it's obviously supposed to be a sort of story about this victimized woman being brutalized by the men in her life, and the idea of this being a pattern for women to be brutalized. And the husband in the broader story, whose wife is telling him this story, he's being rather cavalier about it. I think he's trying to kind of have a good time on this start of a honeymoon, and she's obviously in a far more serious mood, and it takes a longer time to get the hint, but at the end he realizes she was trying to tell him something a little more profound. But along the way, there's just all of this great tension build up for how the young woman reacts to his cavalier attitude. And then like at one point she's disgusted with him enough to storm off into a bath to calm herself down. And then she tells him to get into bed, and like they can, they'll go to bed, and he asks her to continue the story. But as he's seeing her looming in the darkness, she seems like less human and sort of more monstrous herself, like just that tension, ratcheting up, which I thought the author did a pretty good job with that. And the next day, the couple boards a steamer to Greece to start their married life with a little bit of foreign adventuring. And I guess it's open-ended whether or not the marriage will survive the journey, but it does end, I guess, on a hopeful note that she ultimately tells him what the story means, although we as the audience don't get quite so clear an answer. Properties of Light by Star Sue is a coming-of-age story about a Chinese-American girl whose mother pushes her into figure skating in order to sort of have something to do. But it's not necessarily, one of those stories about, sporty mother, pushing a kid into, breaking their bodies for, glory. But it is about this young protagonist, stumbling through learning how to figure skate, making one friend or frenemy, I suppose, through those classes. And it goes into, the politics of female friendships and group behavior. And then it goes into her getting a boyfriend or, flirtation partner or all of that. And nestled into that is the myth of the girl who turns into a swan. I mean, not in a blatantly fantastical way, but it's like it's a metaphor in a very subtle, minor way that's kind of percolating under the story. So I thought it was ruminating and thoughtful. The final story I'll talk about in the Baltimore Review is Among Thorns by Scott Nadelson, which is an Israeli-centered story about a young man who just gets out of the army and is suffering from dizzy spells. We're not sure what's going on, but as some background into his character, he returned from, his post-army abroadness, where he basically was a party guy. He talks a lot about being promiscuous with boyfriends and going through them, and at the point of the story where he goes to see a doctor for his dizzy spells, he has a boyfriend, but is thinking of dumping the guy for being needy, which seems to be basically code for anything emotional he's running away from. Like, he's into the sex, but not anything else. And for a little while, we go into some medical tests and that sort of thing to describe what might be happening with him. And then it takes a turn into the psychological, and it actually is a story that addresses the occupation, because this soldier, or former soldier Ilan, served in Hebron guarding a settlement. But of course, it's a far more complicated situation than just protecting something. And he talked about the settlement of Kahanists, he calls them, which is a far-right Israeli political movement. I'm not sure if it is meant to be literal, but it likely is a literal reference to this settlement of literal Kahanists. And, he goes into, their self-righteous behavior and how, like a lot of the other soldiers, they resent having to, guard these people, and, the political situation that they foist onto everyone. And he ruminates on teenage boys in the community harassing people, and even wondering to a degree, like, here I am supposed to be seeing, the Arabs who, are spitting at me and are angry at me as the enemy, but in a way, I really see these people who I share so little with, who don't even see me as a real Jew, as the enemy. And he's talking about this with his doctor, who actually has just come in to share some, lab results with him. And there's an interesting thing at play with the doctor as well. The doctor is a recent immigrant from America who wasn't, was too old for conscription. It's something that he talks about, that this guy, obviously didn't serve in the army because he did not make Aliyah to come to Israel at that time. And he describes the man in like effeminate terms. So I feel like it goes a little bit into the cultural clashes too, between like the Israeli Sabra macho-ness and then the effeminate of a lot of diaspora Jewish and American Jewish stereotypes. And it's all just, subtle, because, this sort of thing could easily become polemic because it's about a fraught political situation. But I feel like he did a really good job of discussing these issues that really should be discussed about this very complicated and fraught situation, and these realities, these cultural and political realities, and I think he really discussed them with a lot of authenticity. So I very much appreciated that. So that about wraps it up for me here. Not sure if I mentioned in another section, but I'll link the 3 literary magazines I've been talking about down below. As you can probably tell from the lighting and the clothes changes, I've been filming these segments at different times. But now I'm eager to get this video up on BookTube so that I can turn around and quickly film my Friday reads for the next video and next couple of days as well. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thank you for indulging me as I take this step into lesser discussed literary pursuits on BookTube. If you have any literary magazines that you would like to share, I'd love to hear about them. I hope to be back next year to highlight new ones myself, and later this year I will be back to my short story spotlight playlist to do more videos on short stories and short story collections, so stay tuned for that as well. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and keep writing to everyone out there, my fellow short story writers and poets and so forth who might be interested in literary magazines on that account. And I'll see you next time.